In the winter of 1893, the people of Flathead Valley, Montana, thought they had seen everything the frontier could throw at a man. They had watched grizzlies wander into town, survived droughts that cracked the earth like shattered glass, and buried neighbors who underestimated January. But they had never seen a man from the other side of the world hollow out pine logs, pack them full of ash, and stack them into the walls of a cabin. They called it madness. They called it filthy. They called Rajesh Das a fool who would freeze to death before Christmas. But when the temperature plunged to 50 degrees below zero, when the winds screamed across the valley like a wounded animal, and even the sturdiest homesteads buckled under the fury, only one cabin stood warm. Only one family slept through the night without waking every 2 hours to feed the fire, and it belonged to the man they had mocked. Rajesh Das was born in 1861 in a small village outside Dhaka in the Bengal region of British India. He grew up watching monsoons flood the rivers and famines hollow out the faces of his neighbors. By the time he was 20, he had buried 2 siblings and learned a truth that would follow him across oceans. Survival belongs to those who understand the earth beneath their feet. In Bengal, the poorest families built their huts from mud and rice husk ash, materials the British colonists dismissed as primitive. But those huts stayed cool in blistering summers and warm during the brief, damp winters. The ash trapped air. The mud held heat. It was not magic. It was physics older than any empire. When the Great Famine of 1886 tore through Bengal again, Rajesh scraped together passage money and sailed for America, carrying nothing but a cloth bundle and generations of knowledge locked inside his memory. He arrived in San Francisco, worked the railroads east, and watched American settlers in Montana burn through entire cords of wood every week just to keep their cabins above freezing. They woke every 2 hours to feed the fire. They shivered under wool blankets while drafts whistled through chinked logs. Rajesh thought to himself, "These people do not understand heat. They only understand burning." By 1895, he had saved enough from railroad wages and odd jobs to buy 40 acres of valley land south of Glacier Country. The property sat in a low basin where ancient volcanic activity had deposited layers of ash in the soil, pale powder that most ranchers cursed because it made the ground chalky and difficult to plow. But Rajesh knelt down, scooped a handful of that earth, and smiled the way a man smiles when he finds exactly what he has been searching for. His wife, Mira, who had joined him 2 years earlier through an arranged marriage brokered by letters across the Pacific, stood beside him with their infant son wrapped against her chest. She looked at the barren valley, the skeletal cottonwoods, the jagged mountains capped in early snow, and whispered, "This is not Bengal." Rajesh nodded. "No, it is better. The earth here remembers fire." Within a week, neighboring ranchers rode over. Tom Hadley, a thick-necked cattleman whose family had been in the valley since the 1870s, shook Rajesh's hand and asked what he planned to build. When Rajesh explained his intention to fill cabin walls with volcanic ash, Hadley squinted like a man trying to read a foreign language. "You mean to pack dirt inside your walls?" "Not dirt," Rajesh answered quietly. "Insulation." Hadley rode away shaking his head. Mira watched him go with worry creasing her brow. "They think we are strange." Rajesh replied simply, "They think wrong." Word spread quickly, the way gossip always does in small communities where entertainment is scarce and judgment comes cheap. At Morrison's General Store in the Crossroads settlement of Elk Fork, ranchers gathered around the pot-bellied stove and talked about the Indian fellow planning to stuff his cabin with grave filler. That was what Carl Engström called it. "Back in Sweden, we buried the dead in ash," Engström said, spitting tobacco juice into a tin can. "Now, this Bengali wants to live inside it." When Rajesh came in the following Saturday to buy nails and rope, the laughter didn't stop. It just got quieter, the way cruelty does when it wants to be heard but not confronted. Rajesh set his purchases on the counter, paid an exact coin, and paused at the door. He did not raise his voice. "In my country, we learn to keep warm without destroying forests. When your wood runs out in February, you will understand." He walked into the cold afternoon light. Behind him, someone muttered, "Crazy as a loon." But Tom Hadley, standing near the window, said nothing at all. The worst confrontation came from the person Rajesh loved most. Mira stood in their temporary canvas tent, the baby fussing against her shoulder, and argued with a fierceness that surprised even her. Ash is unclean. It is what we sweep from cooking fires. It is waste. In America, people build with proper wood, proper nails. Why must you bring the old ways into a new country? Rajesh sat cross-legged on a folded blanket, sketching his cabin design by lantern light. Because the old ways work, Mira. Ash does not burn, it does not rot quickly, and it holds warmth the way a mother holds a child, gently, completely, without letting go. The Americans lose half their heat through their walls. I will build once and we will be warm for 20 years. Mira stared at him, torn between practical wisdom and the desperate desire to fit in. If this fails, they will never let us forget it. He looked up, eyes calm. It will not fail. Rajesh's design was unlike anything the valley had seen. Standard cabins used horizontally stacked logs, chinked with moss or clay and barely insulated. Rajesh planned double-walled construction, an outer shell of lodgepole pine, a 4-inch cavity packed with volcanic ash and river clay mixed 3-to-1, then a second inner layer sealed with plaster of ash and animal tallow. The result would be a continuous thermal blanket of trapped dead air held stable by materials that resisted moisture and temperature transfer. He felled lodgepole pines, split each log lengthwise, hollowed a channel down the center using an adze he had forged himself, and packed that channel with his ash mixture before binding the halves back together with iron bands. Each log became a sealed thermal unit, wood outside for strength, ash inside for insulation. He stacked these modified logs into walls, filled the cavity between
Imagine
courses
stepping
with
off
loose
a
ash,
steamship
tamped
in
firm with a wooden
1890s
paddle.
America,
Mira,
the
despite her
air
protests,
thick with
began helping
promises
after
of a
the
new
first
for
week,
Arup, a
mixing
young
ash
man
and
from
clay,
the
while their
sun-drenched
son
villages
napped
of
in a
Bengal.
basket beneath a
This
cottonwood
wasn't
tree.
just a
She
new
said
country.
little, but her hands
It
moved
was
steadily,
a new.
and
He'd
Rajesh
left behind
understood
the
her
familiar
silence was a form
scent
of
of
faith. She
monsoon
was not yet
rains
ready
and
to voice.
blooming
At
jasmine
Morrison's
for the
store, a
vast,
betting pool
unforgiving
emerged.
landscapes of
Engstrom put
Montana,
$1 on the
a
cabin
place
collapsing before
whispered to
December.
be the last
Hadley
best
wagered 50
place for
cents on
those
it
brave
lasting
enough
until Christmas,
head
but no
skills.
further. Only
Not
Morrison
with
declined
a
to bet, saying
six-shooter
quietly,
or a
I've
lasso,
been wrong about
but
stubborn men
with
before.
his hands
The science
and
was
the ancient
sound.
knowledge
A standard
passed
8-inch
down
pine
through
log has an
He
R
was a
value of
builder,
roughly
a
1.25
craftsman
per
who
inch.
understood
A
that
well-chinked
in the
cabin might
rugged
achieve an
frontier
overall
town
wall R
of
value of
Prospect
8 to
Creek,
10,
his
adequate for
dark
mild
skin
winters,
and strange
dangerously
accent
insufficient for
immediately
Montana's
set
sub-zero
him
extremes.
the seasoned
Rajesh's
loggers and
volcanic
prospectors,
ash, porous and
men
riddled with
hardened
microscopic
by
air
brutal
pockets,
winters,
achieved approximately
looked at him with a
2.5 to
mixture of
3.0 per
curiosity
inch.
and
His
they
double-wall
called him
design, with
Raja
its
and
combined
Indy,
12 inches
their
of
words
ash-packed
dripping
cabin
with
and ash-filled
condescending
logs,
amusement. When
reached an
Arube
estimated R
staked his
value of
claim
30
on a
to
small
35,
plot of land
comparable
just
to modern
outside of
fiberglass
town,
insulation,
the
and
locals
utterly unheard
watched.
of in
They saw
1890s
him
frontier
not with an
construction.
axe, but
Furthermore,
with a
the
shovel
thermal
and
mass of the
buckets,
clay ash
gathering
mixture
clay
absorbed heat
instead
during the
of
day
felling
and
massive
radiated it back
pines.
through the
He
night,
was
where his
meticulously
neighbors
weaving
burned
a
40 to 60
lattice of
pounds of
slender
firewood
willow.
every
What
24
in
hours and
blazes
still woke
is that
shivering.
fella
Rajesh
building?
calculated his
To mud
cabin would
hut.
require less than
He'll
15
freeze
pounds per day
solid
to
come
maintain
first
65
frost.
degrees,
Another
even
would
at 50
chuckle,
below outside.
spitting
Pastor
tobacco
Wilhelm
juice
Gruber
onto the
visited
dust.
one October
Arupe, he
afternoon,
was building
suggesting
what he
gently
knew.
that Rajesh might
In
consider
Bengal,
building in
the
the
sun
American
was the
fashion to better
enemy,
integrate.
and their
Rajesh
homes were
offered him tea
designed to
brewed in a
keep the
Bengali
blistering
clay pot
heat. The
in reply.
technique was
The
called
American fashion
wattle and
wastes 4
daub,
times the
but
wood
with a
and keeps a
unique
family half as
bent.
warm. I
He
respect your
created
traditions,
a thick,
but I will not
double-walled
freeze my son
structure,
to honor them.
packing
The
the
completed
space
cabin stood
between
low
the
and
willow
compact,
lattice,
its walls
not just
oddly
with a
thick, its
mixture
surface
of clay,
plastered
but
smooth and
also
pale as
with
bone.
dried
It will
grasses
crack
and
in the first
cattail
hard
fluff
freeze,
he'd gathered
Engstrom
from the
predicted.
nearby marsh.
Looks like a
This
tomb,
method
their wives
created
whispered.
countless
Mira
tiny
heard these
air
comments and
pockets,
carried them
a
home like
principle
stones,
of
but said
insulation
nothing,
his
because she had felt the
ancestors had
interior walls with
perfected
her own
over
palms and
centuries
noticed
to
something
fight
remarkable.
the sweltering.
Even on nights when
Arup
frost
reasoned
blazed their
that
tent,
what
the
keeps
cabin
heat
walls
out
held a
can
faint,
also
residual warmth, as if
he
the earth
plastered the
itself were
walls
breathing through the
smooth
ash.
with a
The
final
first snow
layer,
came
and
November
for the
4th.
roof,
By
he used
mid-November,
a thick
temperatures
thatch
dropped
of
to 15
reeds,
below.
laid in a steep
Rajesh moved
pitch
his
to
family
shed
in
the heavy
and lit a modest
snows
fire.
he'd been warned
Not
of.
the
The
roaring
finished
blaze his
cabin
neighbors
looked
required, but
different.
a small controlled burn
It
of
was
split pine,
rounded,
no larger
organic,
than a man's forearm.
and seemed to
Within
grow
an hour,
from the earth.
the
It
interior
had
reached
none of the
62
sharp,
degrees and
angular
held with a stability
authority
that
of
made
the log
Mira stop
cabins
and
that
simply
dotted
stand
the
in the center of
townsfolk
the
rode
room,
by,
eyes
shaking
closed,
their
feeling
heads.
warmth that did
Poor
not
fella,
flicker or
they'd
fade.
say.
Across
He
the valley,
once
the familiar
the
rhythm
local store
reasserted
owner,
itself.
a man
Hadley
named
woke every
Henderson,
2 hours.
who had shown
Engstrom's
a
wife piled
sliver
buffalo
of
robes on their
kindness,
children and still found
even
ice on
offered
the
him
window
a
panes by
bunk
morning.
in his
The
storeroom,
Morrisons burned through
genuinely
their first cord
fearing
of wood
for
in
his
9
Arup
days. In the Das
politely
cabin,
declined
Rajesh added a single
quiet
log at bedtime and
confidence in
slept
his.
until
Then
dawn.
the winter
Then the
came.
real fury hit.
It
The
arrived
blizzard arrived
not as a
December 9th,
gentle
roaring
dusting
down
of
from the
snow,
Canadian Rockies.
but as an
Temperatures
Arctic. The
plummeted to
locals
30
called
below,
it a
then
blue
40,
norther.
then 50 degrees
Temperatures
below
plummeted
zero
to
by the third
20,
morning.
then 30,
60-mile-per-hour
then an
gusts turned
unthinkable
snow into
40
horizontal
degrees.
missiles.
The
2
wind
homesteads
howled
lost their
like a
roofs.
banshee,
Engstrom's
driving
barn lost
snow
its north
into
wall.
every crack
Hadley's
and
woodpile vanished
crevice
under
of
an
the log.
impenetrable drift.
Inside,
Inside
families
conventional
huddled
cabins,
around
families
their
huddled
roaring
in terror.
stoves,
At 50
constantly
below,
feeding
the
them
temperature
precious
differential
firewood,
exceeded
yet
100
still
degrees
shivering
Fahrenheit,
as
an energy
icy
gradient
drafts
that sucked
snaked
BTUs
across
through
the
pine
very
logs
logs
like water
of their
through a
homes,
sieve.
groaned
Hadley burned
and
over 80
cracked
pounds
in the
of wood in
extreme
24
cold. In
hours
town,
and watched his
worry for
interior
the
drop to
Indian
38
fella
degrees.
turned into a
His
grim
children
certainty.
shivered
No
under
one
every
could
blanket the
survive
family
that
owned.
cold.
In the Das
A
cabin,
search
the
party
ash-packed
was
walls
deemed
reduced
pointless.
heat loss to a fraction
They'd
of what
just
conventional
find a
construction
frozen
allowed.
body in the
With a fire
Henderson,
consuming
the
just
store
12 pounds
owner,
of wood per
felt
day,
a pang
the cabin
of guilt,
maintained a steady
wishing
64
he had
degrees.
insisted
The
a
thermal
room
mass,
stay
which
were
had
2
been
weeks
absorbing
into
heat
the
for
deep
weeks,
freeze. The
radiated
blizzard
stored energy
finally,
back
the
with
sun
the slow
emerged,
generosity of
casting
sun-warmed
a
stone.
brilliant,
Their
blinding
son
glare
played on
a
the floor in a
world
cotton
buried.
shirt.
A group of
Mira
loggers,
cooked
their
rice and
faces
lentils without
chapped,
wearing
and their
gloves.
spirits
Outside, the
low after
apocalypse
being
howled.
cooped up,
Knocks came at
decided to
midnight
check
on the
on
third
their
night.
traps near.
Desperate, ice-crusted
As they
fists
trudged
pounding against
through
the
the
pale
deep
walls
snow,
that had been the
they
subject of
expected
so
to
much
find
derision.
a collapsed,
Rajesh opened the door
snow-covered
to find
mound.
Carl Engstrom in the
Instead,
shrinking
they
darkness.
stopped
His
dead
wife behind
in
him
their.
carrying
There
their
stood
youngest
a
child
roof's
in a
cabin,
frozen horse blanket.
completely
Their
intact.
cabin had become
A thick
uninhabitable.
blanket of
Interior
snow
below 30
insulating
degrees.
its thatched
Windows
roof
cracked.
like a
The
coat,
stove
and from the
unable to
small,
compensate.
well-placed
Please,
chimney,
Engstrom
a
said,
thin,
and the
lazy
single
wisp
word
of
cost him
smoke
more
curled
pride than he had
peacefully
spent in
into.
50 years.
It wasn't the
Rajesh stepped
frantic,
aside without
desperate
hesitation.
plume of
Within
a
an
fire
hour, the
fighting
Engstrom
for
sat
its
stunned
life,
into silence
but
by
the gentle
warmth that
breath
enveloped
of a
them
warm
like an
and
embrace.
stable. The loggers
Engstrom pressed his
exchanged
palm against the
bewildered
interior wall
glances.
and held it
It was
there.
one
"It
of
is
them,
warm," he
a
said,
burly
his
man
voice
named
strange
Gus,
with
who had
disbelief.
been one of
"The wall
Arup's
itself
loudest
is warm."
mockers,
Rajesh
cautiously
handed him
approached
tea
the
brewed
door,
with
and
ginger.
a moment later,
The ash
the
holds
door
what the
swung
fire
open.
gives. It does
A
not let
wave
go.
of
By
gentle,
morning, 2
comfortable
more
warmth
families had
washed
arrived,
over
the
them,
Petersons
a
from a
stark
half-mile north and
contrast
old
to
Greta Schultz,
and
a widow
there
who
stood
had walked through
Arup,
the blizzard alone
not
rather
shivering
than freeze.
or
The
frostbitten,
cabin, designed
but
for 3,
comfortable
sheltered
in a
11
simple
people through the
whoosh.
worst
He
of the storm.
smiled.
Not
Gentlemen,
once did the
he
temperature
said,
drop below
his
60
voice
degrees.
calm.
By
Would
dawn
you
of the
care
fourth
for
day,
some hot
as the
tea?
blizzard exhausted
It is
itself into
quite
sullen
chilly
gray
out.
silence,
Stunned into
Engstrom sat
silence,
with
they
Rajesh by the hearth
shuffled
and asked,
inside.
with genuine humility,
The air was warm,
how the system worked.
not stuffy
Rajesh
or
explained
smoky,
patiently.
but
The
genuinely,
trapped air
deeply.
pockets,
A
the thermal
tiny,
mass,
efficient
the reduced
stove in the
convective
corner
loss,
glowed
and Engstrom
softly,
listened the way a student
consuming
listens to a teacher he has
surprisingly
only
small.
just recognized.
They
Tom
looked
Hadley
at the
arrived
thick,
that morning,
smooth
having
walls,
dug his family out of
touching
a
them
cabin that
with
had dropped to
calloused.
29
They were
degrees.
not cold to
He
the
stood
touch.
in the doorway,
They
felt
felt
warmth
solid.
rolling over him, and
Arup
removed his
explained
hat.
he spoke
Das,
of the
I owe
double
you an
walls,
apology.
the
You
packed
owe me nothing,
insulation
Mr.
of
Hadley,
grass
but
and
you owe
fluff,
your family better
creating a
walls.
firm.
It
He
could have
described
sounded
how the
cruel,
thick
but
clay,
Rajesh delivered it with
baked by the
such
summer
calm
sun
sincerity
and
that
now
Hadley simply
protected
nodded
by
and
snow,
asked, "Will you
held
teach
the
me?"
heat
Rajesh
like a
shared
massive
everything.
stone
The ratios,
battery,
the double wall
radiating
construction,
it
how a
back
single
into the
cow in
small
an
space
adjacent
long
lean-to,
after
generating
the
roughly 4,000
It was the same
BTUs per hour
principle
through a
they
shared
used
ash-filled
to
wall,
keep
could
their
reduce
homes
firewood
cool
consumption by
under
another
the relentless
30%.
Bengali
He described
sun.
how Bengali
Just in
farmers
he
had
wasn't
understood for
fighting the
centuries
cold.
that animals
He
and
was
humans were
working with
complementary
it,
survival
using the
systems,
snow
each warming the
itself
other
as
through walls
another layer
designed to
of
conduct heat
that
inward
day.
while blocking
Something
cold.
shifted
By
in
spring of
the laughter and
1896,
mockery
3
died,
families were
replaced
constructing
by a
fresh
grudging,
insulated cabins
then
under
genuine.
Rajesh's supervision.
Raja and
Hadley
Indy
tore out
were
his north wall
forgotten.
and rebuilt it
He
with
was a
ash-packed
Roop,
logs.
the man who
Engstrom
built.
converted his barn first,
That
then his
winter,
home.
loggers
Even Pastor
started
Gruber
coming to
quietly
him,
asked for
not
advice
to
on
mock,
insulating the
but
church
to
hall.
ask. They
Rajesh
brought him
taught without
timber
arrogance.
and supplies
He showed
in
ranchers
exchange
how to
for his
identify
advice.
suitable ash by
How
texture.
can I seal the
best
drafts
crumbled
in?
like
What's
chalk
this
and
you
held its
say
shape when
about
compressed.
packing
He
mud and
demonstrated
straw
the
in the
tamping
A
technique.
Roop's small
The critical
round
importance
cabin
of keeping fill
became a
material
landmark.
dry. He shared
A
freely
testament
because in
to the
Bengal,
idea that
knowledge hoarded
knowledge
was
is
knowledge
universal
wasted, and a warm neighbor was
ingenuity
safer than a
knows
cold one.
no book.
That
He had
final
brought
morning
the
of the
wisdom
blizzard,
of a hot
Mira had
climate
stood by
to
the
one of the
hearth watching the
coldest
gathered
places
families eat
and
breakfast,
proved that
and something shifted
sometimes
inside
the
her chest.
old ways
She looked at
from a
Rajesh,
world
who was
away
drawing wall
hold the
cross-sections
most
on brown paper
innovative
for
solution.
Hadley's
He
wife,
didn't just
and said quietly,
survive the
in
Montana
Bengali,
winter.
so only he would
He
understand.
tamed it,
You were right.
using the
I should
knowledge
not
of
have
his
doubted.
ancestors
For a moment,
and a
the cabin
quiet,
full of rescued
unshakable
neighbors, the
belief in his
vindication of
own
everything he had carried
he
across an
plastered
ocean,
the
all of it
walls
fell away.
smooth with
There
a
was only a
final
man
layer,
and
and
a woman
for the
who had built
roof,
something
he
together
used a
that
thick
neither could have
thatch of
built alone.
reeds
Their
laid
son
in a
crawled
steep
across the
pitch
warm
to
floor
shed
and
the
grabbed
heavy
Rajesh's
snows
pencil,
he'd been
and the
warned that the
cabin filled
finished
with
cabin
laughter. The
looked
laughter of
different.
people who had survived
It
something
was
terrible
rounded,
and emerged
organic,
transformed.
and seemed
Rajesh
to grow
Das
from
lived
the
in his
earth.
valley
It had
cabin
none
until
of the sharp,
1921,
angular
expanding
authority
it
of
twice,
the log
once to add
cabins
a
that
livestock
dotted
wing
the
that reduced his
townsfolk
winter
rode by,
firewood consumption to
shaking
near
their
zero,
heads.
and once to
Poor
accommodate
fella,
his
they'd
growing
say.
family of 3
He
sons
won't
and 2 daughters.
The
all of
local
whom learned to
store
mix
owner,
ash
a
and
man
clay
named
before they learned to
Henderson,
read English.
who had
By
shown
1903,
a
a
sliver
territorial
of kindness,
agricultural report mentioned
even offered him
ash-insulated
a bunk
construction
in his
as a growing
storeroom,
practice in the Western
genuinely
valleys.
fearing
Though it
for his
credited the
Arup
technique to local
politely
ingenuity
declined
without naming
a
its
quiet
Bengali originator,
confidence in
a
his
historical
then the winter
erasure
came.
tragically common for
It
immigrant
arrived
contributions.
not as a
The
gentle
principles,
dusting
however,
of
were
snow,
not lost.
but
When
as an
vermiculite
Arctic, the
insulation
locals
was
called
commercially
it a
introduced
blue
in the
norther.
1920s,
Temperatures
it
plummeted
operated
to
on
20,
precisely the same
then
physics,
30,
lightweight
then
mineral
an
material
unthinkable
filled with
40
trapped
degrees.
air, poured into wall
The
cavities
wind
to resist
howled
heat
like
transfer.
a banshee,
The lesson
driving
remains what it
snow
was on that
into
frozen December
every
night,
crack and
when a man who had
crevice
crossed
of the
an
log.
ocean with nothing but
Inside,
memory and
families
determination
huddled
proved
around
that
their roaring
efficiency will always
stoves,
outlast
constantly
brute force.
feeding them precious
Rajesh Das
firewood,
did not
yet
survive the
still
worst blizzard
shivering
in
as
Flathead
icy
Valley's history
drafts
because he
snaked
had more
across
wood,
the very
more money,
logs of
or
their
more
homes
muscle.
groaned
He
and
survived
cracked
because
in
he
the
understood
extreme
that
cold.
warmth
In
is
town,
not created
worry
by
for the
burning
Indian
harder,
fella
but by
turned
losing
into
less.
a grim
That the
certainty.
earth,
No
if you
one could
listen to it,
survive
will
that
teach you
cold.
everything you need to
A
know
search
about
party
keeping
was
your
deemed
family safe.
pointless.
That the wisdom of
They'd
the so-called
just find a
primitive world is
frozen
not
body
primitive at
in
all,
the
but is the most
Henderson, the
sophisticated
store owner,
engineering available
felt
to
a
anyone
pang
willing to
of
set
guilt,
aside their pride
wishing
and learn.
he had
In the
insisted
end, the cabin
Arup
they called a
stay
tomb
with 2
became a
weeks
monument.
into the deep
The
freeze.
man they called
The
a fool
blizzard
became a
finally,
teacher,
the sun
and the wisdom they
emerged,
dismissed as
casting
foreign
a
became the
brilliant,
standard by which
blinding
an entire
glare on a
valley
world
rebuilt its
buried.
future.
A group